When we recessed, we were in the middle of a roll call, and we announced that the roll would be held open for members who wish to respond after the votes on the House floor. Are there members who wish to respond to the vote? Clerk will recognize those members.
Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no.
Yeah, I'll tell you in a minute.
Mr. Engel. No. Mr. Engel votes no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon votes no.
Thanks. Are there any other members that wish to be recorded? If not, the clerk will tally the vote.
Those are the people who are not. Oh, yeah. I think so. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Rush? No. Mr. Rush votes no. Or Murphy? It's the only one on your side. Oh, but
Is the clerk prepared to announce the vote?
ask for 2 seconds.
Oh, there are some members
Coming.
still coming. Certain, we'll wait.
We're prepared, Dan.
Clerk will announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 25 and the nays were 31.
25 ayes, 31 noes.
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Hold on. I apologize. That vote, the ayes were 22, the nays were 34.
22 ayes, 34 noes. The amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Before I recognize anybody, I just want to inform people that we have a number of tellers, and there's a check and a double check to be sure that all the votes are correct. And that's the least we can expect. When members here vote, every vote should be counted, and all the votes should be counted correctly. An amendment
Mr.
would
Chairman.
now.
Oh, I do have an amendment at the desk. If I may be recognized.
Pardon?
I have an amendment at the desk. If I may be recognized.
Let me go to the Democratic side. Oh, okay. Gentleman's recognized. Mr. Radonovich, you have an amendment to offer to the bill?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Number 595A at the desk. It's the 100% electricity price increase amendment.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Recently in California, the California Air Resources Air Board released a report that talked about the California global warming bill that would actually benefit California's economy. But Dorothy Rothrick, who's a spokeswoman for the California Manufacturers and Technology Association, says this analysis is long on wishful thinking but short on economic reality. Even though it was supported by the Sierra Club and the NRDC, she went on to state that there is no evaluation of the real-time costs that California businesses and consumers will pay up front. She says, governments can get away with deficit spending, but in the real world, families and businesses have to pay bills every month or there are severe consequences, says Shelley Sullivan, who's the executive director of AB 32 Implementation Group. We are looking at billions in increased electricity, natural gas, gasoline, and fuel prices, billions in new carbon fees and water fees, higher building costs, rents, and mortgages, and the California Air Resources Air Board assumes that we can afford to pay for all of this and wait for savings 12 years from now. Ms. Sullivan and Ms. Rothrick worry that increased regulation and costs will result in business flight to other states or countries where less stringent laws would ensure an overall increase in pollution. Ironically, a California business could relocate to India or China, where the mix of energy consumption includes coal, which would pollute the atmosphere worse than if it stayed in California, says Rothrick. The state's industries are among the cleanest in the world because of strict regulations, she says. Higher taxes, fuel, and labor costs already mean that doing business in California costs more than anywhere in the United States. And it's with that in mind that I submit this legislation that states that under the reporting of the Secretary of Labor, if there's under the reporting of the Secretary of the Energy, if there's a 100% increase above 2009 electric rates adjusted for inflation, that the provisions of Title III of this act will cease to be effective. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have to say, and I ask for a recorded vote on this amendment.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
Mr. If I may reclaim him just a couple of minutes.
Yes.
I do want to state that Edison Electric in Southern California just today increased their rates from anywhere between 10 to 15% on residential users. So this is the effect that Californians are having on their state global warming bill. And this type of rate increases on residential users will be experienced nationwide if this type of legislation is adopted. And with that, I yield back and thank the chair and ask for a recorded vote.
What, Mr. Chairman?
Gentlemen, yield to you.
I
Mr.
just
Bodanovich, you could,
yielded back.
Mr.
I
Barton.
would yield to Mr.
I
Barton.
want to make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Yeah. Well, the gentleman is correct.
Ask for a call of the committee.
Well, we could do that, but why don't we continue to debate this? You want everybody here for the debate?
Oh, okay. I thought, sure, no. I'm not ready. You can. I don't mind. Sure. Okay, fine. Yeah.
We
Gentlemen,
can just have a show
withdraws.
of hands on this amendment. I think.
Well, we're not ready yet because we haven't debated it. We've only heard one side. You're all anxious to vote.
just a show of hands. We can avoid the roll call.
Okay. Well, that would be helpful. But let's if gentleman's time is almost over, but he's yielded it back. So the chair will recognize himself. And with all due respect, I do have to oppose this amendment. This amendment, like so many of the other amendments we've had during this markup, provides that if a certain event occurs, the provisions of Title III will cease to be effective. And I don't think that makes sense. You're trying to put out all sorts of awful situations that would require us to act and act immediately. But whether the action should be that the whole Title III of this proposed bill, this proposed law, should be ineffective, is a serious question, and I think an inappropriate response. I don't want an automatic off-ramp which dissolves the legislation. There'll be a lot of consequences to that, and we may well need to address the specific problem that is causing, in this case, on this amendment, as much as 100% increase over 2009 electric rates adjusted for inflation. So with all due respect, think this is not I know it's a message amendment. I know it's for many of you to say those who support this proposed law weren't even willing to look at the fact that there could be a tremendous increase in rates. Well, we do care about the increases in rates, and we would want to respond to the increase in rates. But the only response that you are suggesting we take is the one that you want to ordain now, and that's to stop the whole law from taking effect and staying in effect. So it's a meat-axe approach. It doesn't deal with the problem, whatever the problem is going to be. We don't anticipate rates to be increasing as a result of the way the market has been structured, and as a result of the Space Amendment that is going to protect the ratepayers by making sure that the allocations are used to protect those ratepayers from any increase in their utility costs. I also want to say in response to my friend from California, if there are increases in California's rates, I don't want it to be stated as a fact that it's due to California's energy law. I remember so well when California had the spike in our electricity rates, and we met with Vice President Cheney, and we said California's on the ropes because our wholesale rates were so high. You've got to help us. And he said, well, that's due to your environmental laws. You shouldn't have all those environmental protection laws in California. Well, you know, it turned out that what we told him was right, that we were being gouged by the wholesalers, the Enron company particularly. And the reason we know this was true is when we found out that the tapes from Enron, conversations of executives, that they would withhold wholesale power just to drive up the rates. They even chuckled over the fact that a lot of elderly and low-income people were going to have to pay a lot more for their electricity, but they were going to make a lot more profit as a result of it. So I wouldn't jump to conclusions, as we sometimes hear from people who say California's problems are due to environmental laws, and I think the suggestion is if there are increases in California, it's due to our environmental energy laws. I won't accept that as a fact that could just be stated, because I don't believe that to be true, and I would want to see a lot more evidence than just a statement of fact. This amendment is now before us.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield on that moment?
Yes.
You know,
Mr.
the
Stupak.
chair mentioned that these are nothing but message amendments. I'm looking here at my BlackBerry, and since we started this markup, I've received 5 attack messages from the Republican National and NRCC Communications, the latest one being last night at 10:29 last night, saying that we're against jobs, saying we're against America, saying we're for high prices of. So you're absolutely right. This is just another message amendment, and those of us on the committee who may be in, like in my case, a Republican-leaning seat, but I'm a Democrat, we can be assured there'll be another press release. So I've had 5 now in the first 2 days, and I'm sure when we're done with this markup, by the time we're done, probably at least 3 more. So these are just message amendments. They're not sincere. They're not really towards promoting good legislation or correcting or identifying a problem. It's just for message. So I hope we would stay united and vote no, because I don't want to be the only one getting these emails. Thanks. Now yield back.
Mr. Barton, you ask,
I want
seeking
to
recognition.
speak in support of it. Well, first of all, truth in advertising. Some of these do have a message. There's no question about that. It's not necessarily an attack on our friends on the majority side as much as is it an effort to send a message to the American people that we want to protect them from what we think are the potential ravages of this bill. We have offered a price protection amendment at 10%. We've offered a price protection amendment at 20%, and now we're offering it at 100%. At some point in time, there should be some recognition from the proponents of this legislation that if prices do go too high, Title III, this particular amendment refers to Title III, which is the cap and trade mechanism, shall cease to exist. Now, there are sections in the bill that we've not addressed yet where there are massive unemployment compensation schemes in place. So there is some recognition in parts of this bill that there are going to be some negative economic consequences. We're just trying to put a price cap on the electricity increase. And again, there's an acknowledgement of that on the majority side. We did accept an amendment from Mr. Space of Ohio that has some effect on that, which is an improvement in the bill. I also want to comment very briefly on the comments about the California electric market from several years ago. California devised its own electricity market within the state of California in which they outlawed long-term contracts between distribution companies and power suppliers. They created a system where everybody who provided power to electricity users in California had to buy that power on the spot market every day. They then, because of various restrictions that the state put in place on new power construction, hadn't built a new power plant in California in between 5 and 10 years. And when the California population and economy grew, they created a situation where you had a limited amount of power that had to be auctioned off every day on the spot market. And the Enrons of the world, seeing that situation, did take advantage of it. Chairman's correct about that. But the California legislature itself created the environment in which they didn't allow long-term contracts. They didn't allow power, large power consumers to enter into direct contracts with power suppliers outside of the state, and they forced everybody to buy their power on the spot market. And to compound it, they added a provision that everybody who bought power on the spot market had to pay the market clearing price that the last person to put power into the market.
Will the gentleman yield?
Be
I
happy to
may.
yield.
I agree with what the gentleman's saying, but the true problem with the crisis in California was failure of the then Governor Gray Davis to act to force the utilities into long-term contracts immediately, which would have ended the crisis then and there. And it was that he could have done that, but it was that failure of leadership that extenuated the
Just to
problem in
reclaim
California.
my time.
So-
We finally, the Bush administration and the FERC chairman then was a gentleman named Pat Wood from Houston, Texas, put price caps on the California market. The FERC then authorized a series of investigations that ended up in some of the market manipulators paying massive refunds and going to jail. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to proceed to a vote, but the Chair wants to just make a very brief statement. California had a very dysfunctional market based on a law that was promoted by Ken Lay and Enron and some of the other big companies, and then they took advantage of it. And my only point in raising that was not to get into the emotional debate about who did what in California, but Vice President Cheney said to me personally, the problem in California is you have all those environmental laws. That's why California is paying such high rates for electricity. And he refused to acknowledge what we knew later to be the case, that Enron was taking advantage of this dysfunctional market that was created. But on the amendment that's pending, I think we just have to disagree. There is no point where we'll say the law ought to be put out of effect, because there are a lot of consequences when that happens. There are people who will be relying on the law, and just to suddenly pull the rug out from everybody and say the law is no longer effective is not a solution to a problem that we do not anticipate to exist. And if it does exist, it may not be the appropriate response. So we have a disagreement over this issue. We've had a number of amendments on it, and I would urge defeat of the amendment. How do you wish to proceed? Do you want a show of hands? Do you want a roll call vote? Okay, let's go to a roll call vote.
Mr. Chair.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshue. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sutton. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye.
The
Mr.
clerk
Shattuck,
will
no.
call those members who have not yet responded to the roll.
Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Clerk will tally the vote. Mr. Markey, you want to vote
Not
on this?
recorded, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, you are recorded.
Markey? Mr. Markey votes no.
Mr. Burgess, are you recorded?
Oh, let's see. Not recorded. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Okay.
Is the clerk ready to report the vote?
Yes, sir. On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 19 ayes and 30 noes.
19 ayes, 30 noes. The amendment's not agreed to. Chair would like to recognize Mr. First of all, I want to recognize Ms. Castor for a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, an extraordinary statement of principles on energy and climate legislation has been issued this morning by 30 governors across the political spectrum, 23 Democrats, 7 Republicans, including my own governor, Charlie Crist of Florida. It's a broad statement of responsible, pragmatic, and far-sighted leadership on one of the most important issues of our time. So I'm pleased to share this statement with the committee and ask unanimous consent that it be distributed now. 3 important points from this bipartisan statement by the governors. First, that we urgently need a comprehensive strategy on energy. Second, that we invest in using energy more efficiently and producing more clean energy here at home. And third, that we set a cap on greenhouse gases to reduce emissions to levels guided by science to avoid dangerous global warming. The governor's statement also says that it is in the states where the green economy will be built, and the states and the governor's pledge to work with us here in Congress to develop a partnership to build an energy efficient and energy independent and energy secure economy. Mr. Chairman, I believe this statement of principles by these 30 governors with significant bipartisan support is fully aligned with the principles and policies and programs in this historic legislation. I hope later today we will respond to our governors by voting to report this important bill from the committee.
I thank the gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman.
Chair would now recognize Mr. McNerney.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
May I just ask the gentlelady from Florida one question?
Yes, gentlemen, recognized.
The gentlelady from Florida, I would like to ask if those 30 governors endorse this specific legislation.
I think they are endorsing a strategy that is fully consistent with the bill we've considered here over the past few months and will vote out today.
But they do not endorse this bill.
I think their action is clear when it comes on the day that we are going to vote out the legislation. I think the message is crystal clear.
Chair recognizes Mr. McNerney.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to engage in a colloquy with you.
Certainly, gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The American Clean Energy and Security Act is groundbreaking legislation that will combat climate change and create countless clean energy jobs. I'm proud to support this bill, but I would like also to take this opportunity to discuss an important issue that I hope we are able to address as this legislation moves toward consideration by the House. The bill issues allowances to power producers and distribution companies to protect customers, and provide a smooth transition to the clean energy economy. The bill appropriately distributes allowances to companies producing electricity under long-term contracts that do not allow them to recover costs associated with carbon regulation. A similar arrangement was made under the Clean Air Act's Acid Rain program. At this time, however, the bill does not provide allowances to cover these same facilities' steam sales, which are made under similar long-term contracts. I'm concerned that this omission may inadvertently harm consumers and companies, including some in California that have acted early and decisively to combat climate change. I would ask that we continue to work together to address this issue. I also believe that my colleague, Mr. Green from Texas, would like to offer comments on this subject, and I yield to him.
I'd like to thank my good friend, Congressman McNerney, for raising this important issue. Mr. Chairman, as Mr. McNerney points out, your bill wisely contains a provision to hold harmless generators with long-term contracts to provide power who can't recover their costs because their contracts do not anticipate carbon regulation. However, the bill as currently drafted would exclude an important group of cogeneration facilities, including some in Texas, from receiving this temporary relief because the bill only covers power contracts with electric energy, not thermal energy in the form of steam. And now, Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that only a relatively small portion of allowances have been set aside for these generators with long-term power contracts. It's also my understanding that if we were to make clear that those who are in the exact same circumstance with regard to thermal contracts can apply to receive allowances from this small pool, it would not affect the total or the percentage of allowances currently made available to LDCs or merchant coal under the bill. Mr. Chairman, I ask that we work together to resolve this problem prior to floor consideration by clarifying that cogeneration facilities that have long-term contracts for useful thermal energy would also be eligible to receive allowances under the long-term contract provisions. And I thank you for, and I yield back my time, or back to Ms. McNerney.
Mr. McNerney, would you yield to me?
Yes, I will yield to the chairman.
I want to thank you and Mr. Green for your attention to this issue. You have our agreement to work with you on this issue as we move this bill forward for consideration by the House. We will do so in close consultation with Mr. Boucher, given his expertise on electricity issues. But I want to thank both of you for bringing this issue to our attention. Does the gentleman from California yield back his time?
Yes, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and much to a lot of my colleagues' chagrin, this might be the last time I get to speak on this bill.
Are you asking
disappointed?
Consent?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Let me just start by saying...
Wait. You asked to speak, and they said this will be the last time you'll speak, and then the gentlelady reserved a point of order.
Against my speech.
Against
no amendment.
Speaking. Do you have an amendment?
I have amendment. Shimka 020.
Without objection, that amendment will be considered...
I was trying to trap her.
Yeah. That amendment will be considered as read. A point of order will be reserved by the gentlelady from Colorado. And I recognize the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. We've learned a lot in this markup. My colleague, Mr. Boyer, raised the issue about the least affected by this bill are actually some of the major authors of this bill. In fact, the Evansville Courier states that since Indiana has 94% coal production, they will be harmed. Illinois, 47.6%, they will be harmed. Kentucky, 93%, they will be harmed. California, in the home state of Chairman, 1%, no harm. Massachusetts, home state of Chairman Markey, 25%, no harm. And it's curious that the districts that aren't harmed are some of the wealthiest districts in the country. Median income of mine is $48,000 based upon the census report, American Community Survey 2007. Mr. Whitfield's is $36,000 a year. Mr. Boyer used $37,000 in his calculations last night. Chairman Waxman, $79,000. Chairman Markey, $68,000 a year. The wealthier districts pay less. What a shock. The poor districts pay more. We ought to be ashamed of ourselves. Many of these poor districts have coal mines, so we're now in a double jeopardy situation for poor rural America. And I want to ensure that more coal mines do not close, especially in response to the FERC chairman's announcement that there will be no more baseload energy created by coal or nuclear power. My amendment is very simple. If, because of this act, 2 coal mines close, this Title III would be null and void. Now, we've heard talks about the 90 amendments. My staffer put this up. This is not a paid political advertisement. These are real coal miners who lost their jobs in the 1990 amendments of the Clean Air Act. And I would say to those authors of this amendment that the 90 amendments at least were for toxic emittents. Carbon dioxide is not a toxic emittant. So who paid the price? The people who paid the price were Midwestern states. This mine, one mine, 1,200 jobs closed. And I was at that rally to watch politicians come and say, we're going to save your jobs. And they were the very same politicians who voted for the bill. I swore on that day I would never vote for a bill and then go to these guys and say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to fight to keep your job. Now, my colleagues on the Energy and Air Quality Subcommittee have heard this speech before. The rest of the full committee has not. So that's why I bring it up one last time. You know how many coal miners lost their job in the last Clean Air Act amendments? You all know, I've said it 1,500 times. 14,000. The state of Ohio, you know how many coal miners lost their jobs? And that was testimony in this committee. 35,000 jobs. 35,000 jobs. This isn't going to hurt jobs? You got a simple solution. You got a simple off-ramp. 2 coal mines close, an off-ramp. When we were talking about this bill in the previous Congress with the previous chairman, we talked about industry-wide with off-ramps. But we had a change at the helm. Guess what? No off-ramps. And that's what we've been doing for the past 3 days, is talking about off-ramps to make sure that if electricity prices go high, we have an off-ramp. This amendment says if these guys get screwed in this bill, we're going to have an off-ramp to protect jobs. I don't trust you. I don't trust this bill. This bill will cost jobs. And this is a great insurance policy if you really, really, really believe that your bill will not cost jobs. And with that, I will return the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr.
Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Gentleman's time has expired. The reservation of a point of order has been withdrawn. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes, after which we will respond to the vote and come back and vote. So if members want to leave at some point, they can feel free to leave and come, and they will still be able to vote when they return. I just want to point out that coal production in the United States has increased by 15% since 1991. Well, how could that be? And then there have been a loss of jobs in Illinois and the East Coast coal areas. Part of the reason for it is that in 1990, when the Clean Air Act was adopted, the utilities were given the requirement to reduce the sulfur emissions and some of the other pollutants. They could have done that, particularly the sulfur emissions, in one of 2 ways. They could have put scrubbers on, especially when high sulfur coal was being burned. or they could have used low sulfur Western coal. Well, the utilities had the choice, and they chose the least costly alternative. They moved much more in the direction of taking low sulfur Western coal than in paying for the scrubbers. Now, a little history lesson. When we were trying to get legislation through in this committee to deal with acid rain, some of us who wanted to deal with that problem and get the pollution reductions to stop the acid rain offered a proposal that would have provided a subsidy to pay for the scrubbers. And the response to that, I thought, was generous offer was, there's no problem such as acid rain, and we're not going to deal with it. Several years later, in 1990, the Congress passed for a law under the Clean Air Act calling for those reductions without any subsidy to help pay for the scrubbers. And the utilities did what was in their economic interests, and jobs have been lost. And I'm sorry that jobs have been lost, but that was sometimes the result of actions or inactions. There are consequences. Well, we now have a proposal before us that this amendment to stop the implementation of the provisions of Title III if there are losses of coal jobs. This bill, I think, will give the power industry the certainty and support they need to build new coal-fired power plants, ensuring the continued use of coal in this country. So if you care about the coal industry, realize that the utilities are waiting to know what the rules are going to be. And if the rules are that they will be able to build new power plants and use coal in the future, it will bring a better future for coal. If this law does not pass, I don't think it's going to be a clear picture of what the situation will be for coal in this country. We've taken strong steps to protect coal mining jobs by providing the support to build a whole new generation of coal-fired power plants with very low emissions of carbon dioxide. We provide regulatory certainty in this law that we're proposing, and this bill would remove one of the key barriers to building these power plants. The bill dedicates 2% of the allowances in the first few years and 5% thereafter to cover the full costs of installing carbon capture and sequestration technology and running it for the first 10 years of operation. So the bill gives coal a path forward. If the gentleman from Illinois who's offering the amendment wants to defeat the bill, I suggest to him that he would be defeating the opportunity for the use of coal in the future. Now, his specific amendment it says that if by virtue of the provisions of this law, that if 2 or more coal mines close, then all the provisions of Title III will be out the window. Well, I hope they don't have to close, but that's going to be a business decision. But if the law, if this bill, overall bill becomes law, the business decisions that will be made will be to build new power plants, burning coal. Now, that ought to be good news for those from the coal areas and for the environment and for the utilities that want to use coal in the future. So I would urge the rejection of the Shimkus amendment and the adoption of the overall bill that's before us. My time has now expired. The chair would like to declare recess unless we want further debate. Mr. Barton?
I could have 2 minutes.
Gentlemen,
maybe even 1 minute.
I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, to make further comments before we
Very
recess.
briefly, Mr. Chairman, I support the Shimkus amendment. I just want to read from a news article in the Charleston Gazette, either today or yesterday, talking about the bill and complimenting Congressman Boucher on his efforts to improve the bill. The UMW representative talks about some bonus amendment, some bonus allowances that Mr. Boucher has negotiated that should be worth between should be worth around $181 billion between now and 2050. Then the president of the United Mine Workers, Mr. Roberts, said in a statement, the legislation contains many pro-coal items that his union supports, but that he still has some concerns, quote, about the bill. Phil Smith, a union spokesman, said that the UMW supports what Boucher has done and what he says will be a continuing effort to reduce the overall near-term emissions reduction even further to at least 14%. On Wednesday, the National Mining Association issued a statement repeating its prior opposition to earlier versions of the Waxman-Markey bill. The National Mining Association recognizes changes to the original draft of the legislation are intended to reduce harmful economic consequences of the legislation. These changes, however, are not sufficient to produce a balanced and responsible policy for addressing climate change concerns, said Mining Association President Hal Quinn. And, quote, the result will be a devastating loss of high-paying mining jobs, higher energy costs for businesses, and the exporting of American businesses and jobs to countries that do not require similar greenhouse gas emission reductions, end quote. So, we recognize that efforts are being made to protect the mining industry and the coal industry, but if this legislation becomes law, Mr. Chairman, they're going, according to the National Mining Association, be devastating loss of mining jobs, and I don't see how anybody in this country will build a coal plant when with the carbon capture and sequestration technology not mature. A coal plant's going to emit significantly more CO2 emissions than any other form of baseload generation. They're not going to do it.
The gentleman's time has expired. We're being summoned to the House floor to respond to 2 votes. I know other members may wish to speak on this particular amendment, so I won't close the debate, and we'll come back as soon as we can after the second vote.